So let me again welcome you all to the final panel of an absolutely amazing two-day conference. We have had great panels over the 2 days, and we have had an amazing set of discussions on a variety of anti-caste thinkers and thoughts from different parts of India, and they have truly enriched many of us in our own research projects and in our own intellectual endeavors. And we really hope that this conference is not an end, but a beginning for several such conversations on anti-caste thought, which we will continue in collaboration in the near future. So without taking any further time, let me welcome the chair of the last panel, Dr. Scott Stroud, to introduce the speakers and set things in motion. Thank you. Scott, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. And I believe you can hear me, so let me know if that's a problem. We have a wonderful final panel here. I've been very impressed by the ones I've seen so far. Most of them were happening when I was sound asleep or trying to be asleep with our young kids. So yeah, but that's the international conference scene. So today we have 3 speakers. Let me briefly introduce them and say just a couple words about where they come from. And then we'll let them and their papers speak more loudly. Our first speaker is Uday Yerramadasu, and he's a final year PhD student from JNU in Delhi. His work is situated around violence on Dalits by dominant caste in Andhra Pradesh. And in line with the questions of violence, he often works around the entangled notions of sovereignty, political theology, and conditions for the possibility of responsibility. Our second speaker comes from the US, US university at least, Sitharthan Sriharan, and he's an MA student at the City University of New York Graduate Center's Political Science Department. And he's applying to PhD programs this fall, and he's recently had an article published on Periyar and the Devadasi question. And our final panelist is Jadumani Mahanand, and he's an assistant professor at OP Jindal Global University, where he teaches political science. And he has a PhD from CPS, JNU, New Delhi. And his research areas are critical political philosophy, recognition, public good, the caste question, and Ambedkar. All of our panelists have been apprised that they'll get 15 minutes each. I will follow all of them with a couple thoughts I have on their wonderful papers. And then we'll have around 30 minutes of questions for this panel. So any of you out there, other panelists from other panels or audience members, please submit your questions via the Q&A chat box. And we'll, so we can have a nice discussion at the end. Submit them at any time. They will not disturb anyone. If you do them now, we'll get to them later. So with no further ado, let's get to our first speaker, Uday, and he's going to be speaking on A Veritable Chamber of Horrors, the Annihilation of Caste as a Theodicy on Responsibility. Uday, you can take the floor.
Hello. Jai Bhim. I'm 1 second, sorry. Jai Bhim. I'm Uday Yerramadasu. The title of my paper is A Veritable Chamber of Horrors, the Annihilation of Caste as a Theodicy on Responsibility. How to comprehend the breadth, scope, and radicalness of the text, the Annihilation of Caste, the text whose goal is audacious enough not to seek to reform or transform, but to annihilate caste. None but Ambedkar took caste serious enough to understand the immensity of the task he took upon himself, and thus the inner necessity of such a goal. It is useless to attack caste directly. Unlike so many before him, Ambedkar does not wish to strike a blow at caste to reform it. Instead, like Hamlet, he knows that the dagger always misses the target. Like Matthew called upon by Jesus in Caravaggio's painting, instead of acting immediately, both Ambedkar and Hamlet are seized by the moment of impasse. However, instead of hindering the intended goal, this impasse is the source of profound revelation that what ought to be embattled is not simply an object of contempt. Zizek underscores Lacan's interpretation of Hamlet's hesitation succinctly. I quote, "We must look for the reason behind Hamlet's hesitation and prevarication. He, Hamlet, wants to strike Claudius in such a way that by striking a blow to his material body, he would hit the quote-unquote thing in it, the king's sublime body, unquote. Like Hamlet, Ambedkar has nothing but contempt for the thing at hand. Yet, this very contempt is the reason behind the moment of indecision before striking a blow. Indeed, the impasse is not a moment of hesitation, but a moment of awakening. The inner necessity of the task guided him to look beyond the contemptible caste. The same inner necessity put him in confrontation with Plato, carried him to Rome, forced him to revisit the confrontation between patricians and plebeians, and indulge him in eugenics. And finally, in a dramatic fashion, urge him to deal with the question of responsibility. Responsibility is not one among the many intellectual indulgences Ambedkar took upon himself in the course of the text. It is one of the driving forces of the text and an inner necessity of the unparalleled project he has undertaken. The annihilation of caste is unsettling, refrained from consoling, and resolutely restless. The question of responsibility, in a certain sense, preceded the publication of the text. With its unequal boldness and uncompromising attack on Indian tradition, the treatise is an expression of genius. It is no debate. Ambedkar, as a singular individual, is solely responsible for the text. However, despite being the sole composer, the text was intended to be published to the Jatpat Todak Mandal audience. If not for the composition, at least for the assertions of the text, the Mandal is implicated by choosing Ambedkar as the president. By urging Ambedkar to preside over the conference, the committee is presumed to share responsibility in destroying the fetters of Hinduism, which Ambedkar emphatically announced as his purpose. We know, like their hero Arjuna, the Mandal quivered at the paramount responsibility bestowed upon it. Like Arjuna, they wish to kill without being implicated. Ambedkar is very well aware that the Mandal is not up to the task. They have no stomach for it, and they recoil at the moment of decision. Thus, Ambedkar offered them an exit strategy. In a letter to Harbhagan, Ambedkar made it clear, I quote, "So anxious was I to relieve your Mandal from having to assume responsibility for my views, and also with the object of not getting myself entangled by too much intimate association with your conference. I suggest you that I desire to have my address treated as a sort of inaugural address and not as a presidential address, and that the Mandal should find someone else to preside over the conference and deal with the resolution," unquote. And the rest is history. In the book Donner la Mort, The Gift of Death, Derrida emphasizes responsibility as an injunction to respond. Responsibility involves a call to respond, like the call of conscience. I quote, "The call to explain oneself, one's actions or one's thoughts, to respond to other and answer for oneself before the other," unquote. The allusion to this other, on whose presence one ought to respond immediately, raises a question of location, a kind of topographical question. From where does the call come? Heidegger reminds, I quote, "Dasein always understands itself in terms of its existence, in terms of its possibility to be itself and not to be itself," unquote. Dasein, needless to say, always assumes itself as itself. It is oblivious to the fact of not being itself. Yet, this empirical certainty of itself is, at best, nothing but a fiction, an illusion, and, at worst, a philosophical embarrassment. The very possibility of Dasein not to be itself is the condition on which Gayatri Spivak could pose the question, can the subaltern speak? For the possibility of subaltern not being able to speak for themselves, it should be possible that the desires, inclinations, and aspirations of the subalterns are not of their own, but already belong to someone or something else. Something or someone else should have already taken them over to a point where what subalterns speak is already what their oppressors want them to speak and want them to desire. If Ambedkar were to respond to Spivak, unlike many might assume, he would not dispute her opinion. Instead, he would press further, push it to its limits, and pose a counter question that lies on the other side of the wretched subaltern. Can a Hindu god speak for himself? And the answer would be an emphatic no. We can assume this conversation because Ambedkar notes that Rama ought not to be blamed or ought not to be counted responsible for Shambhuka's death. By killing Shambhuka to protect Chaturvarna, acting on behalf of it, and having no freedom to act otherwise, he reduces himself to a cog in the Chaturvarna system, putting to death and assuming responsibility. Considering the immense literature, the task of comprehending responsibility, to say the least, is daunting. Putting to death and being responsible for it are two different things. They are neither simultaneous, nor do they necessarily overlap. An incommensurable abyss separates the instance of putting to death and the moment of assuming responsibility. This abyss is the ground on which it is appropriate to build a stage for the dialogue on responsibility. This ground provides necessary support for Ambedkar's conversation with Hannah Arendt and Jacques Derrida. In their own way, all the three authors thought the possibility and the impossibility of responsibility. These scholars are joined together not by mere fancy. On a superficial level, putting to death is the common binding thread that unites their thinking on responsibility. For Ambedkar, his two most privileged examples of responsibility, or more accurately, irresponsibility or non-responsibility, linger around death. First, Rama putting Shambhuka to death, and second, Arjuna's fratricidal murders are the two significant instances around which he has woven his investigation. For Arendt, Eichmann is both responsible and irresponsible for his actions. However, his responsibility rests not simply on his actions, but on the injunction to respond. Paradoxically, he attains responsibility by his refusal to take responsibility. Unlike Rama and Eichmann, for Derrida, Abraham is a paramount figure of responsibility. Abraham is responsible even before putting Isaac to death. He is responsible despite not killing. Again, paradoxically, Abraham assumes responsibility, unlike Eichmann, not by refusal, but by renouncing all other responsibilities and ethics. He assumes responsibility by sacrificing and renouncing all other responsibility for the sake of his single, unique, and absolute responsibility he has towards one transcendent God. So far, it is evident that for Ambedkar, Arendt, and Derrida, putting to death never flows smoothly into assuming responsibility. There are conditions, impasse, refusals, reappropriations, and renunciation that ought not to be forgotten. While Rama killed Shambhuka, he is not responsible for the murder because being a king, he is duty bound to kill Shambhuka. Being a king, Rama is endowed with the duty to protect the Chaturvarna system. Thus, the transgressor deserves no less punishment than death, and Rama was expected to give no less punishment either. The system, by its preeminence over the king and even God, absolves the individual of responsibility. The individual, in this case, Rama, is not free enough to decide on killing. Thus, he is not responsible. His action is pre-given, predetermined, and necessary. Therefore, it is not a free action. It is not singularly his to count him responsible. This simplified analysis of Ambedkar's interpretation of responsibility, like Arendt's, counterposes system on one side and freedom and responsibility on the other. In other words, for both Ambedkar and Arendt, the choice is either the system or responsibility. Within the system, like Chaturvarna system, freedom and responsibility are impossible. Either the human being is a cog in the system or she stands on her own right. By being implicated in the machine, the cog has no life of its own, no choice of its own, and thus no freedom and responsibility of its own. It seems it is impossible to be inside the system and to be free and responsible. In this sense, Ambedkar and Arendt shared contempt for the system with Nietzsche. Like Nietzsche, I quote, "The will to a system, for a philosopher, morally speaking, a finer decadence, a sickness of character. Unmorally speaking, his will to appear more stupid than he is. More stupid, that means stronger, simpler, more imperious, less cultured, more commanding, and more tyrannical." This view, though not unsupported by Ambedkar's own assertions, is not tenable. It contradicts Ambedkar's essential purpose in writing the Annihilation of Caste. While such a view resonates with Chaturvarna, it cannot be extended to system as such. Neither such a view is valid for Arendt and Nietzsche. Death covered over and angst. The sixth vow Ambedkar prescribed for conversion among the 22 vows reads as follows. I shall not perform Shraddh, nor shall I give Pinddan. This particular vow in order proceeds in the order given by him, even to the important vows. I shall not act in a manner violating the principles and teachings of Buddha, and I shall follow the noble eightfold paths of Buddha. They even proceed, I shall believe in equality of man, and I shall endeavor to establish equality. A slight glance at ordering of vows reveals that they are put together based on a logical structure. The first 5 vows are concerned with Hinduism. They ask not to worship Hindu gods, not to believe in the incarnation, and most importantly, not to believe Buddha as the incarnation of Vishnu. The later half of the vows deal with equality, not lying, not committing carnal sins, kindness, compassion, love, affirmation of humanity, to which following Buddha's eightfold path and paramitas belong. Finally, all these culminate into embracing Buddhism, a kind of rebirth into the new life of Buddhism from the veritable chamber of horrors. However, in this smoothly flowing structure of the vow, the sixth vow, I shall not perform Shraddh, nor shall I give Pinddan, seems disjointed. Indeed, the eighth vow explicitly states, I shall not allow any ceremonies to be performed by Brahmins. If we consider the fact that the vows have a structure, 2 questions immediately come to forefront. 1, logically, not performing ceremonies by Brahmins should suffice that Shraddh is not performed and Pinddan is not offered. Then, what is the need for this particular vow? And more importantly, what explains the significance given to it? Second, does the structure or its inner logic still valid despite the importance given to the sixth vow? It needs no elaboration here. Both Shraddh rites and Pinddan are concerned with the rights of the deceased. For Hindus, it is no strange matter that the dead never cease to exist. They continue to live. They ought to be consoled with Shraddh rites, and they ought to be offered Pinddan to consume. While humans are never immortal, they are not finite beings either. Death does not end their life. They never indeed properly die. It is here Ambedkar's quarrel with Hinduism reaches its irreconcilable climax. With Shraddh rites and Pinddan, Hindus desperately attempted what Heidegger calls the covering over death. They thus never truly muster enough courage to acknowledge death. The most precious thing that the Hinduism deprives Hindus is their very essence, their finitude. Through these rites, Hinduism takes away what anchors human as a human, her ability to die, her angst over death, and her possible reconciliation with guilt, freedom, and responsibility. Thus, Ambedkar responds to the consoling words offered by Krishna to Arjuna, that Arjuna is not truly killing while murdering his brethren. I quote, to say that killing is no killing because what is killed is the body, not the soul, is unheard of defense of murder. Unquote. Arjuna can never be truly guilty and responsible, nor his brethren can truly die. Worst yet, over no one's death, genuine mourning is possible. There is no tragedy here. Arjuna is no longer a tragic hero who rebelled against fate and succumbed to its blows. He is simply a puppet and marionette in the game of fate, because it is not he, but the fate all along that is pulling the strings and playing the cards. He is just a pawn, thus can never be truly responsible. Thus, Ambedkar continues, this time with pity. Krishna does not seem to have realized what a fool he made of himself. Unquote. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Uday. A wonderful paper. We'll have plenty of time for discussion and comments later. Now we'll move on to our second speaker, Sitharthan, who will be speaking on universalism as foundational to the critique of caste towards a comparative reading of Ambedkar and Hegel.
Thank you. I'll just start my paper now. While aware of the evils of colonialism and capitalism, Dalit Bahujan thought does not always reject universality as a moral and political category, despite its weaponization as an ideological tool of imperialism. This is demonstrated partly by how the Dalit Bahujan tradition regards the principles of modernity, such as reason, as superior to the principles of existing Indian social institutions. Thinkers such as Phule, Ambedkar, and Periyar did not see a modernity as exclusively British or Western. They believed that the principles of modernity could be used to interrogate both the colonial and Indian nationalist forms of modernity. Following this Dalit Bahujan theme, employing the principles of modernity even against itself, Meena Dhanda asserts that a core value of modern anti-casteism is the, quote, necessity to uphold a universal morality, unquote, unquote. While Ambedkar is not the only Dalit Bahujan thinker to posit such a position by any means, he is exemplary on this matter when he states the following in the Buddha and his Dhamma, quote, a society which rests upon the supremacy of one group over another, irrespective of its rationale or proportionate claims, inevitably leads to conflict. The only way to put a stop to the conflict is to have common rules of morality which are sacred to all, unquote. In this passage, Ambedkar argues that a just society must be undergirded by universal morality for it to not be overly dominated by one group or groups against others. For Meena Dhanda, a crucial constituent of this universal morality is our willingness to subject received opinion to critical scrutiny. In the context of the Buddha and his Dhamma, this means Ambedkar rejects the infallibility of the Vedas, a key support of Hinduism's antisocial spirit. This rejection of received thought is crucial because it is only with this presupposition of a critical attitude towards religion that one can even begin to break forms of oppression engendered by it. In this presentation, I seek to demonstrate that reading Ambedkar alongside Hegel would be productive in reconstructing the universalist basis of Ambedkar's thought. Towards this end, I first review some of Ambedkar's criticism of Hinduism from Annihilation of Caste, where he categorizes Hinduism as a false religion, undergirded by rules rather than principles. I then go on to show how Hegel's critique of Christianity and Hinduism alike share similar premises with Ambedkar's critique of Hinduism. In doing this, I seek to show preliminarily how exploring the philosophical foundations of Hegel's critique of positive religion and commitment to universality can help us think of ways to provide robust philosophical foundations for Ambedkar's criticisms of Hinduism, positive religion, and arguments for social and political universality. To conclude, I briefly discuss the stakes of reconstructing the universality inherent to Ambedkar's thought and politics by highlighting the pitfalls of post-colonial studies thus far. In the article, Dr. Ambedkar and the Trio of Principles, Pradeep Gokhale discusses 3 texts from Ambedkar's corpus in order to understand how this understanding of the triad, liberty, equality, and fraternity, evolved from a model that he borrowed from the French Revolution to a political orientation he claims he developed from the teachings of the Buddha instead of French republicanism. The 3 texts that Gokhale draws on for his analysis are Annihilation of Caste, Philosophy of Hinduism, and the Hindu Social Order. The characteristics shared by all 3 of the above texts is that they are critical estimates of Hinduism. They seek to establish what is fundamental to Hinduism as a religion and social order, to make it visible as an object of critique due to the inherent injustice of Indian caste society. Departing somewhat from Gokhale's emphasis, I seek to highlight how Ambedkar's critique of Hinduism is predicated on a conception of religion that is universalist in an emphatically modern manner. For the purposes of this presentation, I will primarily focus on a peculiar part of Annihilation of Caste, so my paper in full, which I'm preparing for submission to JCAST next month, will also include much engagement with the philosophy of Hinduism and the Hindu social order as well. In order to discern how an ethical universalism grounds Ambedkar's critique of Hinduism, it is helpful to turn to the section of Annihilation of Caste titled, Destroying Caste Would Not Destroy the True Principles of Religion. In this part of Ambedkar's famous speech, he asserts that he does not consider Hinduism a true religion because it is more of a system of law or at best legalized class ethics. Ambedkar describes the first problem with such a system as religion in the following manner, quote, the first evil of such a code of ordinances, misrepresented to the people as religion, is that it tends to deprive moral life of freedom and spontaneity and reduce it, for the conscientious at any rate, to a more or less anxious and servile conformity to externally imposed rules. Under it, there is no loyalty to ideals, there is only conformity to commands. Elaborating on Hinduism's demand for unconditional obedience to its laws and traditions, Ambedkar discusses how caste makes Hinduism's corruption of moral life particularly evil, as its prescriptions, which are ascribed eternal validity, are different for different castes. Such a scheme cannot but make humans feel cramped and crippled over time. For Ambedkar, true civilization has a religion of principles, not rules as Hinduism does at its core. Principles are the basis of true religion as they undergird the responsibility of the religious subject in the acts they perform. What is apparent from the above analysis of Ambedkar's critique of Hinduism is that he has what I will call a critique of positive religion. By this, I mean he criticizes Hinduism for compelling its believers to obey its rules without question, rather than live as free, responsible subjects guided by principles. To make this idea of positive religion clearer, I now move on to a similar thread in the work of Hegel. In the introduction to Hegel's India, a volume collecting Hegel's engagement with topics concerning Indian philosophy, religion, and culture, Akash Singh Rathore and Rimina Mohapatra highlight how Hegel's critical writing on the central farcical and corrosive tenets of Brahmanical Hinduism is not too different from the pre-modern tradition of religious thinkers such as Guru Nanak and the Buddha, who criticize the origins, perpetuation, persistence of caste in India, and extends to the modern era and the thought of Uday, Periyar, and Ambedkar. In an effort to contribute towards demonstrating this convergence between Hegel and modern anti-caste thought, I hone in on how Hegel's dialectic relates to his critique of Christianity as a positive religion. In her article, Dialectics as Resistance, Hegel, Benjamin, and Adorno, Hegel scholar Rocio Zambrana asserts that when Hegel discusses how speculative dialectics resist positivity, he is referring to how it interrupts the fixity that comes with one-sided manifestations of freedom as embodied in institutions of modernity, such as politics, religion, or philosophy. The structure of Hegel's dialectics is most clearly and famously elucidated in the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit. However, Zambrana asserts that the stakes of how Hegelian dialectics is defined is better comprehended when one considers one of his early texts, titled The Spirit of Christianity and Its Fate. In his work, Hegel criticizes what he terms positivity. By this, he means an abstract understanding of law and ritual, one that displaces the authority of the ethical, social, or political relations to an external authority. For example, religion is posited if it is constituted around rules, rituals, and dogmas that have been extracted away from the community's life and customs. In Hegel's view, such an abstraction to some extent is a form of violence since it separates individuals from each other, thus diminishing the bonds that make up the community. These codified rules and rituals force individuals to attach themselves to a tradition or God that transcends the community itself, thereby purporting to master the sensuous, living quality of the community, the bonds of life and love that constitute community. In illuminating Hegel's critique of positivity, Zambrana starts with Hegel's Spirit of Christianity and Its Fate, and then goes on to demonstrate how this theme is also present in his later works, such as his first book, The Difference Between Fichte's and Schelling's Systems of Philosophy, and his first mature work, The Phenomenology of Spirit. If one examines how Hegel criticizes Hinduism, one finds a similar focus on its positivity in the sense that adherence to rules and tradition, especially caste, deadens the life of individuals and communities by preventing a subjective relation to God or religion from constituting itself, thus barring the development of human freedom, solidarity, and responsibility. For example, in the philosophy of history, Hegel describes how humanity on the part of a higher caste toward an inferior one is entirely forbidden. To illustrate this, he refers to how a Sudra has the right to knock down a pariah on the spot if the latter has defiled the former. What I believe Hegel and Ambedkar share in their critique of Hinduism is that both presuppose a fundamental universal morality in their critiques. This includes the conception of an ideal subject as a responsible subject that lives according to principles rather than rules. The distinction between principles and rules is crucial, as the former assumes that there is a free agent to live by one's chosen principles in the first place, while rules are mechanical and demand obedience without question. With respect to Hegel, these themes come to the fore in the following passage, for instance. If we proceed to ask how far Hinduism exhibits the morality of the Hindus, the answer must be that the former is as distinct from the latter, as Brahm from the concrete existence of which he is the essence. To us, religion is the knowledge of that being who is emphatically our being, and therefore the substance of our knowledge and volition. The proper office of which latter is to be the mirror of this fundamental substance. But that requires this highest being to be in so a personality pursuing divine aims, such as can become the purport of human action. Such an idea of a relation of the being of God as constituting the universal basis or substance of human action, such a morality cannot be found among the Hindus. In this passage, one finds much of what I intend to glean from discussing Ambedkar and Hegel together. A subjective relation to religion that undergirds the responsibility of the subject, a universalist basis for morality, and an idea of religion as a vehicle for social improvement. In this presentation, I have thought to take some steps towards constructing a comparative reading of Ambedkar and Hegel. In this regard, I focused on Ambedkar and Hegel's respective critiques of positive religion as it manifests itself with respect to Hinduism. What was briefly demonstrated is that both Ambedkar and Hegel seem to presuppose that true religion has at its foundation a universalist morality that enables individuals and communities to live by principles rather than rules as free and responsible subjects, and that Hinduism, as a religion of rules, denies people the ability to have such a life, thus making it ultimately a false religion. In order to illustrate what I believe are the stakes of reconstructing the universalism inherent in Ambedkar's thought, I conclude with a brief note on the pitfalls of post-colonial studies. In describing what problems define critical caste studies, Gajendran Ayyadurai notes that Indian post-colonial scholars have a blind spot for caste, but not race, since the former does not produce a crisis for their life experience. Their theoretical lenses and subjectivity can recognize racial capitalism and colonialism, but not the, quote, collusion of Brahminical casteism and capitalism with the above, unquote. While I would agree with Ayyadurai that an important dimension of why Indian post-colonialism has largely ignored caste is due to Brahminical privilege, I would also argue that a foundational rejection of universality undergirds the previous lack of engagement with Ambedkar and modern anti-caste thought, given how post-colonial studies often equivocates universality with Western imperialism. Elsewhere, Gopaguru asserts that in, quote, emancipatory politics, it is not so much personal life, but the whole world that is at stake, unquote. Elaborating on this, Guru goes on to assert that Ambedkar is exemplary in making this move from the personal to the universal, due to how he so adeptly exploited structures of rejection such as caste, class, colonialism, and patriarchy. It is my hope with the project I have hinted at above that I am able to contribute towards providing an account of Dalit Bahujan universalism, as I believe the theoretical and political positions of Ambedkar, Periyar, and other anti-caste intellectuals can be brought to bear not only on Indian caste society, but also global concerns pertaining to race, capitalism, and identity politics. To elaborate on what I mean by Dalit Bahujan thought and politics having relevance for issues afflicting not just India, but the rest of the world, I end with a passage from the incomparable Kancha Ilaya. We are now prepared to convert that experience in material production into a framework of knowledge. This knowledge has its own historicity. The first premise of our epistemology is the affirmation of the potential of our own selfhood and the comparison of the self with the other. In this process, we, the Dalit Bahujan, will lay the foundations for a transformation of the caste cultural consciousness, which is the very source of inequality in India. The aim is to negate all factors of negation: Hinduism, Brahmanism, feudalism, and capitalism. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Sitharthan. Now we'll go to our third paper, and Jadumani Mahanand will talk on Ambedkar's anti-caste philosophy as democratic theory.
Thank you, Professor Scott. Hi, everyone, and JBIM. It is great pleasure to be part of this fascinating conference on anti-caste thought and philosophy. I personally thank Professor Meena Dhanda and Dr. Karthick for organizing this very, very wonderful, I would say, radical conference at international level. Before I start my presentation, I would like to say something that I inspired from Professor Gail Ambed's work. She generally used this word called anti-caste as a phrase, as a word. It has not been explored. Then second, constant persuasion and constant inspiration from Gajendran Ayyadurai. He is here very much. So this is what my inspiration from, and I'm trying to understand the idea called anti-caste philosophy or thought. So before that, I would also like to state one thing. I have also written a chapter. It is going to be published in 2022. It is called Ambedkar's Anti-Caste Philosophy as the Way of Life in the Pursuit of Justice. So what I have done in my previous paper is to understand how anti-caste is a way of life. So before I, go into the presentation, so Radhakrishnan says very provocatively, Hindu as a way of life. Gandhi said something, Chaturvarnya as a way of life, and there are lot of Hindu thinker, I call them Hindu protagonists. They spoke on the same line, saying that caste is a way of life. I would put in my own way, caste is a way of life. So how one can understand when somebody say Hindu is a way of life or Chaturvarnya is a way of life? I would call this is a caste life. So that was my previous paper that I tried to explore in terms of, a philosophical investigation. This very presentation is trying to explore Ambedkar's anti-caste philosophy as a democratic theory. So let me go into this presentation. Caste is an essential pillar that controls the political, social, economic, and ethical system of Hindu society. On the contrary, Ambedkar consistently argues that philosophy of Brahmanism, in the bracket structure of caste, is the negation of liberty, equality, and fraternity and justice. In other words, philosophy of Brahmanism is incompatible, contradictory, and against the idea of democracy. Ironically, political democracy is being appropriated in post-independent state based on the ruling regime, civil society, organization, political parties, economic setup, moral foundation, and democratic institution like bureaucracy or educational institution where Brahmanism is preeminent and play a predominant role. This is called the body politics of Brahmanism that has been normalized. In other words, Brahmanism, in the bracket casteism, and Hinduism has become a way of life despite of the modern democratic setup. Alternatively, Ambedkar's broader conception of democracy is completely against the structure of caste that is widely available in his writing and politics. Ambedkar's writing on democracy theoretically offer a counter-revolution to Brahmanism. His theory of democracy substantiates the philosophy of anti-caste tradition. It is imperative to engage with anti-caste politics and writing to construct a critical democratic political theory. Arguably, the meaning of anti-caste philosophy is, whether it is meaning of anti-caste philosophy is incompatible or compatible to democracy. So this is a question. So therefore, hence Ambedkar's anti-caste proposition is a distinctive distinctive democratic theory that needs a robust interpretation. This is the core question to explore in this paper. So I would not be able to present whole paper, but let me lay out this so that one can make sense of the paper. So the first part of this paper will try to problematize how politics of Brahmanism, structure of caste, is antithetical to democracy, foregrounding the anti-caste literature as a conundrum to scope for democracy will explicate in the second part of this paper, and third part will demonstrate Ambedkar writing on anti-caste, Ambedkar writing on caste against democracy. The fourth part will explore Ambedkar's fourth conception of democracy and argues anti-caste as a democratic theory. In doing so, I further argue that how Ambedkar goes beyond the caste in theorizing ethical and moral conception of democracy in an universal sense. So historically, the concept of democracy has always been dynamic. In one hand, democracy is sought to operate as a revolutionary idea, pursued for a change by challenging the authority. On the other hand, democracy is a paradox. It is appropriated by the ruling regime and the state precisely based on a political ideology, a party's ideology of a ruling government. It is also an instrument for ruling class. So this is one interpretation. So therefore, one can read democracy as a contested concept. So in the classical political philosophy, Plato had criticized the Athenian idea of popular democracy, which was against knowledgeable. It was ruled by the mob, power of the people that creates chaos in the society. It was the rule of doxa, of her philosophia. So this is a debate, and Ambedkar was very much aware about this debate, and he was somewhere supporting Athenian democracy. So in the modern time, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, I'm not going to deal that. So, but one of the very important time in the 18th century, the social and political movement of American and French Revolution inaugurated the idea of democracy in 18th century. In American Declaration of Rights, feudalism was challenged. It developed respect for capitalism, equality, freedom become a fundamental principle to the Constitution. Yet one cannot overlook the racial and patriarchal discrimination and exploitation in society by the capitalist and white supremacist. The slogan of French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity challenged the traditional authority sought as a revolutionary idea. So in this context, how one can understand the idea of revolution in India? Is or was there a revolution in India? If there was a revolution, what kind of, how one can understand the idea of revolution in India? So, or was there a democracy in India? There are historical questions, need for a conceptual inquiry. One can argue that there was no revolution in India comparable to America and French Revolution. However, the idea of anti-caste is a revolutionary idea. It did not create a situation of civil war like French and America, but the term of an anti-caste has potential to create civil war in a caste-ridden society. A revolution cannot only be understood through civil war, but one can also look at as an idea for a social transformation. The idea of everyday life is a caste life that naturally perpetuates caste atrocity against Dalit as a symbol of the violation of democratic ethos. Thus, it is equivalent to civil war, yet it is oppressed by the Hindu dominant caste and upper caste. Therefore, one need to ask, what is anti-caste? What is to be an anti-caste? Does idea of anti-caste revolutionary against the structure of caste? How the idea of anti-caste is democratic? What is the idea of democracy according to the inheritor of anti-caste thinker and activist? Does it mean that anti-caste is democracy? These are very important questions to explore as to investigate how idea of caste how idea of anti-caste is revolutionary, therefore contribute to the theory of democracy. I argue that the core political philosophy of Dr. Ambedkar could be interpreted as the idea of democracy. Nevertheless, Ambedkar idea of democracy is not one, but it has developed idea of democracy. It allows for a different kinds of interpretation. For example, one can look at the theoretical engagement with the idea of democracy in general for a comparative thought, representative democracy, how democracy protect the idea of minority and the concept of majoritarianism. So much debate in today's time. So there are so much literature on the idea of democracy on Ambedkar. Professor Stroud is here, K.A. Mitra, Jawaharlal have interpreted pragmatic notion of Ambedkar idea of democracy. Valerian Rodriguez, Anand Teltumbre offer a radical interpretation of democracy. Jawaharlal and Narendra Kumar articulated representative idea of democracy and tilted towards liberal affinity of Ambedkar. Anupama Rao argued for minority conception of democracy. Along with Partha Chatterjee and several other Marxist liberal scholars, look Ambedkar through liberal democrat constitutionalist angle. According to Ambedkar, idea of democracy is a revolution in India. To him, democracy stands for a social change in the society. So this is, the available literature. But what I am also calling in the first section is called caste against democracy. So when someone tries to understand the idea of caste, it is generally, understood through power, and power. When you talk about democracy, democracy is always understood as a rule of the people. What Abraham Lincoln, long back, popularized his definition by the people, for the people, and of the people. So then democracy also understood the pragmatic philosopher John Dewey, the philosopher of democracy, says democracy is a way of life in terms of associational ethical life. So also one of the very famous way to understand in political philosophy democracy in terms of equality and freedom. In this context, how one can understand caste in the purview of democracy? One side, the meaning of rule. When we talk democracy as a power and rule, the meaning of rule is said to of regulation through which a society or government regulate in a particular way. The rule is to control or dominate or exercise power as an authority. On the other side, democracy as a way of life, as a governing principle in realizing equality and freedom. How one can understand caste as a rule that dominates, control, and exercise power. This is what happened in Indian democracy. So according to Ambedkar, when we talk about the rule and democracy or the caste as a rule, he gives this definition, very, very interesting definition, called rule as practical. They are habitual way of doing things according to prescription. So, but he also talk about when we try to understand democracy as equality and liberty. According to Ambedkar, inequality designed not merely to punish the offender, but to protect also the dignity and to maintain the bestness of parties coming to a court of law to seek justice. In other words, to maintain social inequality on which the whole scheme is founded. So he also says caste form graded system of sovereignty, high and low. So 1 minute left. I can't finish my presentation. So it is difficult to read all the things. But K.M. Panikkar also one who wrote long back, democracy and caste totally opposed, that one based on equality, other based on inequality of birth. So I would not go into this, but in the post-independence India, caste has been, democracy has been appropriated, and in the democratic framework, we see different kind of caste play as a dominant role. So it is so difficult to talk everything now, but at the end, I would just, what I would say, when I see caste, democracy as anti-caste or anti-caste thinking as democracy, one need to then contextualize whether it is starting from South Bureau Committee and the Roundtable Conference or the Mahad Satyagraha. All these are constitute of democratic thinking. So one need to also contextualize how Indian society or Hindu society is. It is a casteist, Brahminical, patriarchal society that doesn't allow equality, freedom, justice, and so on. So this is very, very contradictory when we are talking about democracy. So in this context, when we think about philosophizing the idea of anti-caste, I think one need to look at other anti-caste thinkers. I have a section, something called anti-caste inheritor, Phule, Periyar, and many others. So, however, they might not, have spoken about the very, modern notion of democracy. but their idea constitute very radical and therefore democracy. So I would contrast with one philosopher, Bhikkhu Parekh. He says somewhere very, ironically, the anti-caste thinker largely relied on the Western ideas and ideal to provide ethical tool to, to where to close modernism. So I completely disagree with this idea. Anti-caste thinker didn't borrow the modernist idea or this radical democratic idea. Rather, it is very much inherent in anti-caste life. Anti-caste life, one can understand how Dalit activists in particular, or Dalit people in particular, are dying on the ground. There are so much discrimination on there. So how one can understand this, like who wants to be discriminated and humiliated and raped and face the death. So therefore, the very idea of or the untouchable that are living today in India or Dalits, they are anti-caste by birth. They are anti-caste inheritor. Of course, there are many other people in terms of social category one can go, but at the end, I'm not going to deal all. So all aspect of Ambedkar conception of democracy is anti-caste, whether it is idea of representation, whether it is idea of voting, citizenship right, constitutional democracy, equality, ethical notion of democracy, everything is anti-caste. So one need to explore this all. So at the end, I would say Ambedkar says democracy as a way of life borrowing from Buddha and John Dewey. Similarly, I argue that anti-caste is a way of life in the pursuit of ethical, egalitarian, fraternity conception of life. So thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. So, and I am also looking forward for some, conversation to happen. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Jadumani. Wonderful. And all the attendees out there, feel free to type your questions as I'm rambling on for a few minutes here with my own comments in the Q&A box. The panelists, the people that have video screens, make sure you type your questions in the chat. So let me talk about all these wonderful papers, and I'm going to keep my comments to about 15 minutes. So we have plenty of time for discussion. One thing, I will not emphasize all the positive aspects of these papers. There are many, but that sometimes isn't that helpful for pursuing future improvements or publications. So nothing I say here is written in stone, and nothing I say is like a damning criticism, but this is just my take on this. Ambedkar is fascinating because every one of us comes to Ambedkar and pulls his corpus, his thought, his meaning in our own ways. And that's part of why he's a great thinker, because he's useful for so many things. Today, you're going to see in these three papers, at least I see, three themes. One is Ambedkar's status, and there's kind of a conflict or a dialectic between his status as an anti-caste intellectual and his status as a democratic theorist beyond just the oppression, as awful as it is, proposed by caste systems. So that's one theme I think these papers tease out. A second theme is the meaning of and the extent of his moral philosophy. What does he have to tell us about classic philosophical areas of ethics and morality? And then third, what can we learn from his thought? Why should we go to him? Now, this is a friendly audience. This is preaching to the choir, but many people where I come from in American academia have barely heard of Gandhi, let alone Ambedkar. And so this is something we all must think about when we're talking in public venues or researching on him and writing on him in public venues, is what does he have to contribute to larger discussions outside of just those that are battling the very righteous battle against caste or exploring the thought of Ambedkar as Ambedkar studies scholars. Let me start my comments and try to give some logical order to them. I will start with Jadumani's paper first, and then I'll go to the other papers, but maybe you'll see the kind of order here. Jadumani's paper is wonderful. It does a very admirable job. The full paper that he didn't have time to present, of course, you always can just do a subset. He does a wonderful job of presenting and placing Ambedkar in the anti-caste tradition alongside Periyar, Phule, etc. And he makes the very great point that caste philosophy is anti-democratic philosophy. And the converse is what he is exploring in this paper and in other projects, which is anti-caste thought is very pro-democratic thought. And this leads me to a question, and this is something I know he's working on in his paper. It's an evolving product. But I'd like to see him plumb deeper the depths of the question, what is democracy? And what is anti-democracy? Oftentimes populist leaders, fascist leaders, tyrannical leaders will talk in pro-people ways. This is what makes them populist in many cases. So what do we mean different when we say democracy is government by the people, or whatever we mean by that term? Also, it seems like he places a lot of weight on the phrase way of life, and I love this as a Deweyan myself. I love this notion of way of life. Two concerns here. One is a small one. Jadumani has a nice quotation in there that I believe is from Dewey, but it was unclear to place that quotation's reference compared to the following ones, where it talks about way of life. One thing I've racked my brain searching the electronic critical edition of Dewey's Democracy in Education, and there's no mention of way of life, that phrase, in Dewey's Democracy in Education from 1916. So I believe that, I think I'm mistaken in attributing that quotation in Jadumani's paper to Democracy in Education. I believe it's someone else talking about Dewey's thought. So be clear on that. I mean, where you see Dewey start talking about this is in 1939 with his Creative Democracy essay. And, I have good evidence that Ambedkar gets this from Kadam in that correspondence in 1954. So, you see Ambedkar slowly start talking more about way of life. But regardless of that historical fact, both Ambedkar and Dewey are committed to the notion of democracy as a habit of everyday life, from early on. So that's clearly there in Democracy in Education, even if the notion of way of life isn't. The second question I would like Jadumani to expand upon in the full version of this paper is, what do we mean by way of life? What do we mean by way of life, especially when we talk about democracy as anti-caste? In India, caste is all-consuming. Okay, but in America, especially for people that do not place themselves in the caste system, caste thought is not perhaps a way of life. So, this is one of the challenges when we talk about democracy in a very limited notion, like the elites appropriate it. Jadumani mentioned that phrase before. This seems to jar with kind of this all-encompassing notion we want to get through Ambedkar and Dewey of democracy as something that tones and qualifies every aspect of our life. Okay, that big. So I'd like to hear more on, now or later in the full paper, what do we mean by way of life and democracy, especially in a larger sense than just caste context. Okay, and then I'll leave it, Jadumani, with this. I mean, your paper does a wonderful job bringing out the two senses of Ambedkar's thought. One as an anti-caste thinker, and second as a democratic theorist. And clearly, all the problems of democracy will not be the problems of racism, will not be the problems of caste thought, although they will be related to some extent, maybe through equality or concerns of liberty. So, I'd like to see you, branch out in the revised paper and talk a little bit more about kind of these two senses of Ambedkar that are in tension, especially when we talk about him as a proponent of democracy as a way of life in India, in Thailand, in the US, or wherever. Now I'll move on to Sitharthan's wonderful paper, where he brings in Hegel. It's almost cruel to bring in Hegel and Ambedkar in a 15-minute presentation. You can't cover any of these expansive writers in hours, let alone one 15-minute presentation. But Sitharthan does a good job kind of contextualizing Ambedkar's thought and then building on it with the comparative analysis with Hegel. One thing, it was in the intro in my paper, and Sitharthan has since moved it to the end, but he does a wonderful job through the work of Professor Dhanda and others, bringing out this kind of tension that I see in my field of communication and rhetoric in the US, where so many scholars have a blind spot to caste. And oftentimes this blind spot is entailed by a commitment to anti-colonialism. Now both anti-caste thought and anti-colonial thought are incredibly important and incredibly useful in alleviating harms and oppressions that, consume much of the world today. But, what interests me is when one of those narratives is taken as a foundational narrative and it excludes the usefulness of the other one. So Sitharthan, your paper on Hegel and Ambedkar is wonderful, if not for the fact that it brings out this tension, and then also the tension of Dalit Bahujan thought that doesn't see the weaponization, as you say, of universality. and morality as a universal thought. So this is just a wonderful setup, and I encourage you to continue on with this project. Now, you engage Annihilation of Caste, and you bring up the distinction between religions of principle and rules. And in 1936, of course, Ambedkar wants a religion of principle, and he mentions that the Upanishads might form the basis of this. Guru Nanak and Sikhism might form the basis of this. It's unclear that in 1936, of course, he's on Team Buddhist 100%, maybe only 90%. But one thing we have to remember, right, and this will be important for my comments in 1 minute, is that distinction is from a passage that he takes from Dewey. And this passage you can find exactly in Annihilation of Caste. And so this is a very Deweyan distinction between principles and rules, rules being things like the 10 Commandments, principles being things in Dewey's employment, like the Golden Rule, that's more imaginative, less specific. Now let's jump, as Sitharthan jumps to Hegel. Sitharthan's wonderful paper brings in Hegel to kind of challenge and make sense of the moves Ambedkar is making. And you label this as a comparative reading. That's fair enough. Again, we could find a lot of useful views on Ambedkar's thought by holding him next to thinkers. Right now I'm stuck in the historical mindset. So, I ask, well, what did he know of Hegel? I found no books from Hegel on Ambedkar's bookshelves and the surviving books. And also I think he quotes or he mentions Hegel once or twice in all 18 volumes of the English collected work. So, I am not yet convinced historically that Ambedkar had Hegel top of mind. I think historically he might have had something Hegelian in his thought through Dewey's naturalized Hegelianism and through Marx, two thinkers that, it's clear that Ambedkar read a lot of and engaged these. So, as you push forward with the Hegel aspect, make sure and really sandbag against resistant readers like me. What's the use of Hegel brought into this discussion? What does he give us that's new that we can see about Ambedkar's thoughts? And let me end my comments on Sitharthan's paper with one aspect here. One of the big dividends of Hegel in this paper is that Sitharthan makes the claim that both Hegel and Ambedkar presuppose a universal morality as kind of the focus of their critique of Hinduism. And they I believe the claim is that Ambedkar's morality is a sort of universal morality. And this is, a tension in Ambedkar's thought. Now, I as a friendly act of criticism, I don't see this. I would offer to Sitharthan. I mean, what's Ambedkar's morality? This is a challenging question, but it seems to be something like societies and individuals should act in a just manner, and justice is composed of a balance among three values of making sure people have liberty, are treated equally, and have fellow feeling or fraternity towards each other. These are the classic three values we've heard, and Gokhale does a wonderful job in that paper that's cited discussing these. So that seems, if you had to give a quick delineation of Ambedkar's moral philosophy, it seems to be something like that. Now, is that a universal morality in the sense that Hegel would have an objection to something like Kant's universal morality? I'm not sure. I mean, the way I read those three values, these are classic ends in view on the Deweyan framework. These are classic ideals seen as a pragmatist ideal. That is an ideal that is contingently taken from the real as a useful guide to the next active experience. And then it comes back down and gets tested against the real. So it's not transcendent and it's not eminent in those kind of rarefied senses. It's the weird pragmatic middle ground. So in many ways, I think Ambedkar's morality, although it's different from John Dewey, he heard these values from Dewey in a passing phrase in Dewey's class in March of 1916, but Dewey never makes much of these three values. Ambedkar makes everything of these three values, but it's the same kind of use, the same endpoint, which is let's find a useful way of talking about justice, but not reify it as a foundationalist notion that has content that's set in stone. So in other words, these three values are used as principles. They're flexible ways of engaging experience, but they're not determinate. They don't have a specific content even. Equality is going to differ in different situations. Look at even the voting regulations and communal representation that Ambedkar proposed. I mean, he wanted different ways of voting for different people, for different communities, but that was in an attempt, or reservation was an attempt to give equality in the most effective way. So even equality doesn't mean exactly one thing in every single situation. So again, I love this paper. I love bringing Hegel into this. And I know Sitharthan has, the room to expand this and further convince people like me that don't speak enough Hegel. Now, for the initial paper, but the last one in my comment stream here, Uday's wonderful paper. He engages a text that all of us know of, and he takes it very seriously, the Annihilation of Caste. He takes very seriously the annihilation part. And I love this aspect of Uday's paper, because so many of us just jump into the anti-caste thought. But Uday makes a wonderful point here. Ambedkar didn't propose reforming the caste system, slightly changing it. He uses annihilation. Okay, so this is an extreme term, and I really like this paper and the promise it has. One thing I've noticed is the Annihilation of Caste is for Ambedkar like the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals is for Immanuel Kant. It's a text that, for better or worse, always centers our discussions of these complex thinkers' thoughts. I'm a Kantian on my every other day, but in Kant's scholarship, in many ways, Kant's mature morals gets taken down a different path because of the influence of the groundwork. So Uday has done a wonderful job engaging Annihilation of Caste in a new way, not just the way where it drags Ambedkar's anti-caste thought in a predictable path. So he brings up some wonderful archival work on the Jatpat Todak Mandal and how it shares responsibility with Ambedkar for the content of this message, the annihilation address that was never given. This is a wonderful point. This made me think about what was it about Ambedkar's appeal that disturbed them. And I'm not sure it's the annihilation of caste aspect. The Mandal seemed on board with that. If I remember right, everyone there had to promise to either marry outside of their caste or have their kids marry outside of someone else's caste. So I mean, it was striking a blow against caste, and I don't think it worried about it not being fatal. So, I think what really bugged the Mandal about this was Ambedkar's claim that there is no quarter for core texts of Hinduism, like the Vedas and the Shastras. So in this way, the annihilation aspect that bugged them was the annihilation of texts that mattered to them. Uday has done a good job in his paper of analyzing the Rama killing Shambhuka episode. And there he brings out this kind of interesting claim that there's a conflict here between systems or responsibility. And I'd like to, see him in the revision of this paper go further in this, because my way of looking at Ambedkar sees systems or ideologies or customs, group shared habits, let's say, as, informing senses of responsibility. So this is why Ambedkar says, we need to switch from Hinduism as an idiom of thinking of ourselves as Dalits to Buddhism as a different way of thinking of ourselves, a different tradition, a different vocabulary, a different kind of custom-based view. So, this is one thing I'd like to see him tease out some more is what is responsibility like under systems like Hinduism or Buddhism? Because surely Arjuna has responsibility. That's why we want to criticize him, perhaps. My last point here, and then I'll end, is that Uday goes somewhere many of us don't. That is, he looks at Ambedkar's 22 vows from 1956 in the wonderful conversion ceremony at the spot now known as Diksha Bhumi. And this is wonderful. This is very important because we just ignore so much about the Buddha and his Dhamma, the conversion speech, the vows. And he looks at these. Now, I would like to hear him be more clear about the organization of these vows. He mentions that there's a first half of the vows and second half of the vows, and that there's some kind of logic behind these vows. When I look at them, they are very randomly placed. Some are what we would call rules in the Deweyan's scheme work, don't do Pindan. Then some of them are principles. I believe in equality, which gives you wide range of application. And it's tough to apply because what does it exactly mean, Dr. Ambedkar, to be, proposing equality? So, go further and explain what organization pattern is there. Second, and I'll end on this point, I love the Theodicy term in the title of this paper, and it was very provocative. I don't hear Ambedkar talked about like this, but in my mind, a Theodicy, at least in the Western tradition, is a defense of God's goodness against things like the problem of evil and such. And so I wanted to, hear Uday in the revised portion of this paper speak more to what was Ambedkar defending or apologizing or rationalizing for if we want to use Theodicy. It seems like people like Tilak would be more in line with the Theodicy for certain elements in the Gita, let's say, than Ambedkar's thought, which is a very harsh, annihilative critique. So I will end on those points. Thank you, all three paper writers, for giving me so much grist to think about. These are wonderful papers, and I know we're all going to read them in print at some point. So now let's open up to questions from the audience. Again, interim, you still have time in the Q&A box. Panelists, people with video screens on, interim in the chat. I see questions here. One from one here from a panelist. Question for Uday and Sitharthan. Since both of you engage with the Zizekian approach, Zizek encourages us to question how the idea of suffering without cause in Buddhism may give license to Buddhists to cause suffering of others, and further notes that the idea of nirvana allows one to commit the most brutal acts of violence from a distance, thereby disavowing responsibility. We can see this in Japanese military aggressions of the past, probably in reference to World War II, and also more recently in Burma and Sri Lanka. How do you reconcile this with your readings of Ambedkar and Buddhism? So the named people can respond. Anyone on the panel could respond that's presented a paper.
You can go first, Uday.
Oh, thank you. In a certain sense, it is very like considering the very problem of like a theoretical discourse with an immediate application. This kind of question is some sort of disjuncture, I feel. And in certain sense, like suppose like of course Zizek himself told these kind of notion that how like Buddhism, when you apply directly into the everyday situation, how it transforms. But if one observes Zizek's entire conflict in a certain sense is certain kind of if I were to say of both Hegel and Heidegger, of majority of in the Western tradition, where their notions of totality and their notions of like absolute are being seen as a direct resulting into some sort of Nazi regime that and Zizek constantly tries to defend the same against like Hegel and Heidegger especially. So in this sense, like it is difficult, like one ought not to go to broader generalizations, like to an extent that like how, and to like to answer, if I were to answer in another sense, there is a certain disjuncture between what Buddhism is known, like historical Buddhism, and Ambedkar's like how Ambedkar transformed Buddhism in a certain sense. And perhaps we need to look more closely how Ambedkar's radical transformation of Buddhism in a entirely new direction, and how this kind of break with the traditional Buddhism has to be looked in a more like these are the bigger and larger questions which I don't think it is possible to address here. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll agree with Uday about I think Ambedkar presents a radical transformation of Buddhism. In terms of reconciling Zizek's comments on Buddhism, I think in that context, when he talks about Zen Buddhism as preventing a justification of war, he's trying to talk about the general aspect of like how a certain subjective position in Buddhism allows one to free oneself of responsibility for killing another person. But what I am trying to do with my comparison of Hegel and Ambedkar is, this is something I hope to develop later, is kind of examine Ambedkar's analysis of sunyata and the Buddha and his Dhamma, and trying to basically tease out kind of this like concept. This is something Zizek has developed, ontological incompleteness, and how like reality is kind of always developing and never really fully reaches an end. But this kind of ontological incompleteness doesn't mean that we don't have a responsibility, and it kind of forces the subject to make a decision in like very contingent circumstances. And so basically, Zizek has said elsewhere that Ambedkar deserves to be studied along names such as Heidegger and Hegel and so on. So I don't think that Zizek is like opposed to like necessarily like reading Buddhism with Hegel and so on. So,
Excellent. Here's another question. Given Periyar's criticism of democracy shared in the keynote today, how do any of you locate your interpretation of democracy as revolutionary from an Ambedkarite perspective? In other words, do Periyar and Ambedkar have opposed perspectives on the prospects of democracy?
Okay, let me take this question. This is a very, very provocative question. When I was reading Periyar, I could make some sense with Malcolm X when Malcolm X criticized democracy, representative democracy, and Periyar coming very, very similar. He doesn't believe the idea of representation, this idea of democratic system. Rather, he was criticizing the framework of democracy or the ideals of democracy because it has been appropriated and tools of the oppressor. So this is one way one can explore Periyar and Malcolm X. But if someone has to understand Ambedkar conception of democracy, I think he knows the casteist patriarchal structure of Indian society. Therefore, you do not have any other option to engage. So therefore, democracy become a scope for Ambedkar to, talk about the annihilation of caste or talk about, through the constitutional, through the democratic method, you can challenge the casteist society. So therefore, then Ambedkar himself has written, therefore, democracy become the revolution in India. So in a very true spirit, if someone has to understand the idea of democracy, one can make sense of that. However, the idea of democracy is being interpreted as a theory in different way in different countries. But in today's talk also, what I have felt is Periyar also tried to substantiate or make the democracy substantial. I mean, very, very deepening notion of democracy where the left out people who are not been represented should represent. So the, Ambedkar and Periyar conception of democracy is so deep and so radical. It challenges all the time these oppressive system and so on. So this is how one can perceive. And there is also a prospect of larger prospect of democracy in this way. So if we then again reinterpret this development of democracy in last 300 years, it is all the time just giving a piece of cake to the oppressed people in order to satisfy them. But now I think time is to reinterpret as a revolutionary tool against this oppressive system. So this is what Ambedkar and Periyar.
Excellent. Anyone else? Other paper presenters?
I'll briefly respond to that. I just have to say I wasn't here for the start of day 2, so I'm not sure I'll respond much to it just due to the time difference. But I think in Periyar's thought, there's a lot of emphasis on criticizing like the deficiencies of like actually existing democracy. While in Ambedkar, he does that and also tries to provide like practical alternatives as like a constitutionalist, basically. However, there are some times that I forget where it is exactly, but Periyar talks about the state as he wants the state to like act like a modern state and intervene in like the public sphere, especially with respect to discrimination along religious and caste lines. So I think what I appreciate about Periyar and Ambedkar, especially Ambedkar, is that he provides a critique of actually existing democracy, but also proposes practical alternatives. And I think there's also a thread of that in Periyar's thought, even though it's not as much developed as in Ambedkar's thought.
Excellent. A related question. It's tagged for Jadumani, but I think any of us could weigh in on it because it's a fascinating question. Is do you see that democracy need not necessarily help anti-caste politics?
Yes, this is very interesting question. Uh, yes, of course, this is what, if someone has to understand the last 100 years of Indian democracy, the question of representation becomes so important that the democratic framework or democratic ideal provides to these oppressed people. But at the same time, what I'm also trying to understand that how democracy is being appropriated by the regime, the political ideology and parties. So therefore, in post-independence India, there is something called identity politics. It is generally relegated to the Dalit Bahujan political parties and the organization. But I think this is a misconception. So I am going to explore the third paper that, part of this, how one can understand the idea of anti-caste in the post-independent democratic framework, because it is all the time reduced to identity question. Rather, I would provoke here, the very existence of Indian politics is caste politics. It is a Hindu politics. So, and it has been, looked upon in different way. So yes, I would agree partly on this, this provocation, but at the same time, as we are, democratic citizen, or, democracy is there, so one need to take this, opportunity in order to fight against the caste. So therefore, democracy become a space, become a tool for the anti-caste, thinkers, activists, and the academicians.
Anyone else want to weigh in on this question?
Yeah, if I can interject for a minute,
Yes.
like in a certain sense, like Ambedkar has always had a certain sense of ambiguity towards democracy. Like in a sense, like more than anything, he is a personally, if I can say, personally struggled against democracy for entire his life in a certain sense. In fact, like suppose Ashwari Kumar's entire work in a certain sense points to the fact that how Ambedkar is constantly alone in his struggle. So in that sense, like when democracy is seen as a certain kind of like empirical evidence that the politics that Ambedkar aspire needs to be certain, needs to be backed by certain number of people, certain calculation of numbers, certain aspect of a kind of followers that he constantly needed for his politics to imagine and politics to like realize. And like even now there is a constant questioning regarding how like how many Dalits were following Ambedkar during his time, how many like were not following Ambedkar. These kind of tricky questions are constantly being raised and asked, answered. But despite that, like in one sense, Ambedkar already, like always, despite whether people are following him or not, or whether like these calculations work or not, despite this calculative work, there is like he as a thinker, he believed in certain, like suppose like I feel suppose Ambedkar and Arendt both are the two thinkers who puts an enormous demand on the oppressed masses, that they cannot simply like, it's not simply possible that their desires, their aspirations are to be fulfilled. Ambedkar constantly emphasizes that it is not enough that you feel certain kind of what laws or certain kind of this thing, but some kind of justice that needs always to be a driving force that ought to be present. So in that sense, Ambedkar is obviously in favor of democracy, but like he goes beyond conventional democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Uday. Yeah, I'm reminded of that one line that Ambedkar loved in Democracy and Education, where he underlines it and he uses it in his own work, where he says, Dewey wrote, society is one word, but many things. And I think the same thing about democracy here. We often use it as the politics in place, and we want to replace it with a normative sense. We have one more question here, and this, anyone can answer this. I believe this is motivated by the line in The Annihilation of Caste, where Ambedkar famously says, caste is a notion and attitude of mind. The question is, can caste be abolished by changing the way we think? Gold star for being very simple, questioner. This is wonderful.
Yeah, this is a simple question, but it needs a philosophical, theoretical answer. So this is very difficult to answer. Ambedkar time and again in various writing, he spoke about caste is a notion, it is a state of mind, and so on. This kind of statement or lines are available in Ambedkar thought. But one need not to only rely on the state of mind or the notion of mind. One has to understand the philosophical, psychological understanding of that statement. It is not just state of mind, or one cannot just change the thinking and change the caste practice. One has to go beyond that, because the materiality of caste is so intertwined, the gender is so intertwined, then political power is so intertwined with this notion of caste. So yes, if someone has to think, think about go away from the caste, the idea of think has to be again contextualized. What way the idea of think to be understood. So I would actually problematize in this way, rather give a definite answer to this. Right? It is not a definite answer. Rather, one need to understand the structure, the materiality, the power dynamics, and psychological. To give an example of psychology. So what about the trauma these Dalit women and the Dalit male, they have gone through when there is an atrocity in the village, when the Dalit woman is being raped and the whole village is in trauma. So how one can going to understand the psychology of caste, right? It is not about just thinking about caste or away from the thinking about the caste, but one has to understand this psychological dimension of this. So it's not easy. It's not easy when we call think.
Any of the other speakers?
Yeah, I'll respond to that. Yeah, I find this question also important, actually, despite its apparent simplicity. The reason I want to read Ambedkar and Hegel together is because I think both of them are good at understanding how ideas are kind of part of reality, but they're not. That's not what reality is reducible to. And I kind of see Ambedkar as almost some sort of at least an implicit dialectical materialist. And in terms of the scholarship on Hegel, the metaphysical interpretations, people like Zizek have been trying to read Hegel as a dialectical materialist. And I do think a notional change away from caste is important, but also translating that into institutions is also important. And Ambedkar provides us a lot of good thinking on that aspect as well. But if we only have institutions, but there's no notional change in caste, then caste lives on forever, as you can see it in India right now.
All right. We may have to end there because a person we owe a gratitude of thanks to, Professor Dhanda, is speaking in 1 minute, and it would be nice to keep the ship on time, trains on time, just for her talk at least. So thank all three panelists. You all have given me a lot to think about. I'm sure everyone else out there a lot to think about. I hope they get a chance to read the details of your arguments now or revised in the future. And so join me in thanking virtually these panelists. And I will hand it over to Professor Dhanda to conclude this wonderful event.
Thank you, Scott. You've been an excellent chair, and the discussion in this paper, the discussion of all the three papers is bound to continue afterwards. As a philosopher, I'm particularly enthused by the interest in combining Ambedkar's thought with more generally with philosophers, and that's what we're looking to do, to introduce Ambedkar to our curriculums, and work such as one being presented today would be really good addition to what we have just begun to do. So thank you very much, all of you.